Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this halaqah, this circle of tafsir, of exegesis of the Quran. Tonight, we will be exegeting the verses of Surah Al Baqarah, starting with verse number 183, going all the way to 188. These are verses dealing with the regulations about fasting. So I have prepared a presentation. I will turn to that presentation and discuss the contents with you. So let me go right there. I need to go first, share screen, and here, this is the screen I need to share. And here we are. Hopefully you can see that. And I will start this presentation as a slideshow from the beginning. So, rules regarding fasting, Quran 2, verses 183 to 188. You will recall, those of you who have been with us for a while doing this, that recently we were looking at the latter half of Surah Al Baqarah, in which we have new laws for a new community from verses 168 to 283. Under that general heading, and as a subcomponent of this larger section of Surah Al Baqarah, we looked at first dietary regulations, and then we looked at laws of restitution and inheritance, which is what we did last week. And you'll recall the difficulties I had trying to translate the verse regarding restitution. Today, we have a simpler task ahead of me. I will be dealing with the rules regarding fasting from verses 183 to 188. Now, fasting is known to all of us. However, we may find some nuances in the Quranic text about this that we did not expect. So let's proceed. Verses 183 to 184, I've combined the two here in this translation. Believers, fasting is prescribed for you for a limited number of days, as it was prescribed for those before you, so that you may be conscious of Allah. But those of you who are sick or on a journey should instead fast an equal number of missed days later. There is, however, an alternative for those who are able, the feeding of a needy person for each day of Ramadan. Of course, if you do more than this voluntarily, that will be good for you. Fasting is better for you if only you knew. Verse 185. When you know that you are in the month of Ramadan, you should fast, for it is the month in which the Quran was revealed as a guidance for mankind, as clear proofs of the guidance, and as the criterion for distinguishing between right and wrong. But those of you who are sick or on a journey should instead fast an equal number of missed days later. Allah does not desire hardship for you, rather, He desires ease for you. For He desires ease for you to complete the number of days, for you to proclaim His greatness, and hopefully for you to be thankful. Verse 186. If my servants ask you about me, I am near. I answer the prayer of those who pray to me whenever they pray. Therefore, they should respond to my call and believe in me so that they may be guided. 187. Men, on the nights of the fast, you are permitted to have intimate relations with your wives. They are garments for you, and you are garments for them. Allah knows that you are deceiving yourselves in this respect, so He has forgiven you and granted you ease. Therefore, be intimate with them and seek that which Allah has ordained for you. You may also eat and drink until the white thread of dawn becomes distinct to you from its black thread. Then fast until the onset of night. But refrain from intimate acts during the time when you remain attached to devotion within the mosques. These are the limits imposed by Allah, so stay well within them. In this way, Allah explains His revelations to mankind so that they may be conscious of Him. 188. Believers, do not eat up your property among yourselves in a vain manner, nor should you knowingly hand it down to the judges, seeking thereby to sinfully devour a portion of the property of other people. And that's the last verse I wanted to look at for tonight. I want to move back over the verses and just make a couple of quick comments about my translation. Look at verse number 185. The Quran, when you know that you are in the month of Ramadan, you should fast, for it is the month in which the Quran was revealed as a guidance for mankind. Now, if when I read it out, I realized how different that sounds from the way we would expect today. So I will go over this and change that to humankind instead of mankind, because we don't want to be male-centric in the translation, unless there is a good reason for that. Now, in the next couple of verses, here in particular, verse 187, we started with an address to men. And we could also change that, but here too, I noticed that towards the end, in the last couple of lines, it says, in this way, Allah explains his revelations to mankind so that they may be conscious of him. So I would change that as well to humankind, because it's not only being explained to men, it is being explained to men and women, to all people. However, this particular verse, I have kept it as an address to men, because to change that, I mean, realistically, it's meant for both men and women to understand, because a man is not going to do this unilaterally. It's men and women. Men and women, it is lawful for you on the nights of your fast to have intimate relations with your spouses. So that would have been the way to do that. But too much would have to be changed in the verse itself, and I've therefore decided to just keep it close to the traditional rendering of this. So basically, I started with the pictorial translation of the Quran, and I have made some modifications. I missed the mankind one. I should have changed that to humankind, but I deliberately left this as men after thinking about it, actually starting to changing, but then realized that I would have to change more in the verse. And then it seemed to me in the end better to just keep it the way it was in the translation. However, we should be sure that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing in his book both men and women, and this is not meant to be a male-centered book, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have any need or a reason to support men above women or to favor one gender over the other. And we should avoid letting our translations of the Quran reflect such a bias, which would be our bias, or the bias of people at the time of the Quranic revelation. But we shouldn't attribute such a bias to Allah Azza wa Jal himself. And for this reason, sometimes when there is a mention of a person in the singular, when it says, whoever does this, let him know this. So I would translate this as, as for people who do this, let them know this. So I would change to a plural in order to avoid the implication or inference that this is just simply talking about men doing things. It's about men and women. So the plural works best. People who do that should know this, and so on. Okay, so a few comments. Let me go back to the beginning and make a few comments regarding that. So verses 183 to 184, fasting is prescribed for you, and I've put for a limited time, which is actually borrowed from the second of these two verses. That's why I have the two verses combined here, because the second of the two verses would begin by saying ayyama ma'dudat, for a limited number of days. But then it seems to be like disjointed. So I've combined this so that it goes smoothly as a reading. Fasting is prescribed for you for a limited number of days, as it was prescribed for those before you, so that you may be conscious of Allah. Now, this shows that fasting has a purpose behind it. First of all, it's not only for us believers. It's not that believers should have a sense that, wait a minute, looks like Allah has spited us here. Why is He giving us this regulation? And it doesn't look like other people have this kind of regulation as well. So what is it about us Muslims that Allah is giving us this harsh thing to do. So the answer to that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed it for those before us as well. And it is for a purpose. The fasting has a purpose, and that purpose may not perhaps be gained by some other means. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us this institution that will fulfill that purpose. What is that purpose? It is so that we will develop the consciousness of Allah. How do we do that? This is the result of our fasting. When we fast, we become more conscious, we become more aware of Allah Azza wa Jal, because the hunger is going to remind us that we're doing this for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal. That continuously makes us conscious of Allah. And if we are going to refrain from food and drink, which are normally good and normally we consider halal, and there's no reason why we should not use those. In this case now, while fasting, we're refraining from those. It's simply because we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us so. And so if we are going to refrain from the good things, just because Allah tells us to refrain, then of course, even the bad things, we should be even more careful about in refraining from them by the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I have translated the word taqwa as conscious of Allah, to be conscious of Allah. So taqwa would be consciousness of Allah, so that you may have taqwa, as you may be conscious of Allah. I think this is a better translation here than to say fear of Allah. The word taqwa can have a certain sense of fear. And you know how I showed you the 26 different translations lined up on islamawakened.com. So there I find that many of the translators put be mindful of Allah, so that you may be mindful of Allah. Perhaps that captures the idea a little bit better, because being mindful of Allah may include a certain degree of fear. But why did I choose consciousness of Allah? I mean, that's how I feel today. Maybe another day I will feel differently and then change it back to being mindful of Allah. But I chose consciousness for the moment because I think that in the English language, it's more natural for us to speak about God consciousness than to speak of like God mindfulness. It doesn't ring nicely in the English language. You see, a lot has to do with conventions and languages. And when we're translating, so one philosophy would be to try and find equivalent dictionary words to give an accurate translation as possible. But another idea is that we need to translate the idea into the target language, so that when people in the target language are reading what we have translated, they get the original idea, like they grasp it as easily as it would have been grasped by those who are reading the Arabic original and those who understand the Arabic language. So these are two different philosophies. Obviously, we can be somewhere in between, trying to strike a balance between being overly literal and being too paraphrastic, I don't know the correct word there, or to paraphrase too much, so that we lose the essence of what was being conveyed. So striking a balance in between, I think this is the best balance, to say the consciousness of Allah. But as I said, I'm not firm on that. Maybe tomorrow I'll change it back to be mindful of Allah. Now, you notice here that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives a concession. Those who are sick or on a journey should instead fast an equal number of missed days later. So if you miss days due to illness or due to traveling, then you fast the days later. Now, something might be said here about taking the Quran literally versus taking it in terms of the spirit of the teaching. Sometimes there too, we have to strike a balance. We're not talking about translating anymore. We're just talking about actually understanding, whether we're using English as the medium of understanding or Arabic as the medium of understanding. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying basically that fasting is prescribed for you. Kutiba alaykum siyam. Fasting is written over you, to be extremely literal here. But as for those who are sick or on a journey, so alayhim, ala alladhina, for those who are sick or on a journey, their responsibility is to fast an equal number of other days. Some commentators in our past have taken it so literally that they said, oh, the sick person is not required to fast on the day of Ramadan. They're required to fast the other days. See, this is how they took it. Like we would normally take it that, okay, you're obligated to fast during the month of Ramadan. That seems to be the spirit of it. But if you're sick or you're on a journey, you have a concession, you can fast an equal number of other days later. But if you felt up to it and you wanted to fast even while you're on your journey, especially seeing that journeying nowadays by plane and so on is easier. I'm not talking about COVID-19 days now. This is a new reality, a new phenomenon. But normally, traveling by plane and so on is, not like sitting on a camel's back and going through desert conditions for hours. So we can understand why the concession was given to people in the past while they're traveling. But what about now? We don't need that concession, many will say. So what if you felt comfortable and you wanted to fast even while you are traveling? Well, that classical interpretation says that no, you can't fast. Well, you can fast if you want, but it doesn't remove the obligation, because your obligation was not to fast on those days of Ramadan when you were traveling. Your obligation actually was to fast the equal number of days outside of Ramadan. So even if you fast those days, you still have to fast the equal number of days outside of Ramadan. So that's a super literal application of the text. But of course, we should not go so super literal. We should take it in a reasonable way, what seems to be the intention behind it. And the intention is obviously what everyone would instinctively recognize, that normally you are obligated to fast in Ramadan, but if you happen to be sick or traveling during that time, well, then you can delay and fast an equal number of other days outside of Ramadan. Now, there is, however, look at the last part of this, where in the fifth line rather, there is, however, an alternative for those who are able, the feeding of a needy person for each day of Ramadan. Now, the word that is translated here, able, وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ يُطِيقُونَهُ, so it's almost like those who can manage it. But then the it is not clearly specified. Does it refer to fasting during the days of Ramadan, or does it refer to paying the charity? So this has been interpreted both ways, and in the English translations, you will find it both ways. Some translate it to mean those who can afford the charity should give the charity, and some translate it to mean that those who are able to fast but choose not to fast, they are required to give a charity to feed a poor person for each day of the fast. And some interpret it to mean that those who would have been able to fast but with great difficulty, or with varying levels of difficulty, as reflected in various translations, that those who are able to fast but with difficulty would instead have this alternative of feeding a poor person for the day of the fast. However, it seems to me that to translate it as those who can fast but with difficulty requires a bit of reading into the text. It's not so very clear to me that it means that the Arabic text means to fast with difficulty. In fact, some of the early commentators who wanted to say that those who are unable to fast should feed a poor person, they took it to be as if the Arabic included the negative particle la. Those who are not able. So then it becomes very clear, those who are not able to fast. And then that is said to apply to old people, for example. But one might say that, okay, so old people, it's not impossible for them to fast. They could fast, but with difficulty. But still, we would give them the concession to feed a poor person instead of fasting on that day. Some others explain this. The classical tafsir books explain that in the early days of Islam, those who were able to fast but chose not to fast were given the option to give the charity instead of fasting. But later on, when the community became seasoned with fasting, then that permission was withdrawn. And the very next verse we're going to look at, they're saying, cancels that original permission. So that earlier, those who were able to fast but did not fast could pay the charity. But now the verse we're going to look at next says, no, everybody must fast, and now it no longer gives that concession. So now we must decide, are we going to subscribe to the idea that verses of the Quran abrogate each other like this, where one gives a permission and the other one takes it away? Now, classical Muslim commentators on the Quran did generally take that as the modus operandi in exegeting verses of the Quran. They said this verse cancels this other verse. But as many of our great scholars have found over time, many of the examples of such a cancellation offered in classical books of Islamic commentary are not really good examples of such a phenomenon. So we can find in some books that up to hundreds of examples can be given where this verse cancels what is said in the other verse. However, Al-Imam Jalaluddin As-Suyuti narrowed it down to 20 or 21 cases, discounting the rest. And going even further, Shah Waliullah of Delhi narrowed it down to about 4 or 5 cases in his book Al-Fawzul Kabir fi Usul al-Tafsir. And generally, or maybe not generally, but it's becoming more and more the case that modern students of the Quran, such as myself, we are arriving at the idea that the Quran does not abrogate itself in this way, and that all of the verses of the Quran apply in some way. Some may give more of a specification to what was said before or what is said in another verse, but it's not that one cancels the verse entirely or cancels the permission that was previously given. Now, in a previous session, we looked at verse number 106 of Surah Al-Baqarah. That verse says, مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ أَوْ نُنْسِهَا نَأْتِ بِخَيْرٍ مِنْهَا أَوْ مِثْلِهَا. Whatever verses we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring one better than it or equal to it. Now, this has often been advanced by classical Muslim commentators as proof that the Quran itself acknowledges that its verses might be abrogated, some by some others. However, us modern students now look at that and say, no, look at it in the context in which it was mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah. It is clear that the Quran is replying to the recalcitrant people of the book who were objecting to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. They're saying, look, we have a law in the Torah, and now the Quran comes and brings a new law. We cannot accept the Quran. And the Quran's answer to that is that Allah is repealing some of the laws which are there in the Torah, and it is Allah's right to do that. He can bring new laws for a new community, and it's the new laws that have to be followed. So the Quran is not saying that verses of the Quran abrogate each other or cancel out permissions given in some other verses of the Quran, but rather that the Quran is canceling some things that were said in the previous revelation. So now that we decide on that, then we realize that this verse has to remain as it is, and we cannot consider it to be canceled. And once a permission is given, it remains in terms of the Quran itself. We may have other reasons for thinking that there is a different regulation here, but the Quranic perspective on this is clear. Of course, this verse concludes, of course, if you do more than this voluntarily, that will be good for you. Fasting is better for you if only you knew. Now, verse 185, when you know that you're in the month of Ramadan, you should fast, for it is the month in which the Quran was revealed as a guidance for humankind, as clear proofs of the guidance, and as the criterion for distinguishing between right and wrong. But those of you who are sick or on a journey should instead fast an equal number of missed days. Allah does not desire hardship for you. Rather, He desires ease for you to complete the number of days, for you to proclaim His greatness, and hopefully for you to be thankful. So this verse is saying essentially the same thing that was said previously. It's not canceling any previous permission, as we can see. Same permission is there basically about being sick and on a journey. It doesn't say anything more about those who are able, but at the same time, not saying anything more means it doesn't cancel what was said about that either. All right. Now, 186. If my servants ask you about me, I am near. I answer the prayer of those who pray to me whenever they pray. Now, one might ask, what is the relationship between this and the previous verses which deal with fasting? Well, the relationship seems to be that even though this verse says nothing about fasting, it is speaking about that God consciousness that we described in the very first verse that we translated in this series tonight. Uh, because when a person is praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and fasting, then one becomes very much aware of the closeness of Allah Azza wa Jal. When you're fasting, in particular, you from morning till night, you're aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching over you. And even if you were in your private moments, you're not going to do something that interferes with your fast, because you know that even though you are closed off from all human eyes, you are not hidden from Allah Azza wa Jal. And so you're going to observe the rules of the fast even in that situation. So you are very much aware of the closeness of Allah. And so the closeness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is what this verse is about, fits in nicely with the verses regarding fasting. And it shows that there is a pairing between praying and fasting. And of course, in Ramadan, we do that. We pray a lot, and also we fast. We read Quran, which is another way of praying to Allah Azza wa Jal. We make dhikr and so on. So the two go hand in hand, and hence the verse is nicely connected with its previous verses, and even the one that comes after it, because this clearly deals with fasting. And here's the verse that comes after it, 187. Now, addressing men. On the nights of the fast, you are permitted to have intimate relations with your wives. They are garments for you, and you are garments for them. Now, that is a nice short phrase in the Quran saying they are garments for you and you are garments for them. When we come to look at the Arabic text, as we have a little bit of time remaining tonight, we will see that that phrase is very short. Hunna libasul lakum wa antum libasul lahun. So a short phrase like that could easily be memorized by almost anyone. And then again, when you are called upon to say something about Islam, you can actually quote the Arabic text, showing that there is a reciprocity between husband and wife, that they are garments for each other. And so there is a sort of equality which is promoted here in this verse that should not be missed. And when we speak about the equal rights of men and women, that would be a verse that you want to quote, or that part of the verse. Just these few words: Hunna libasul lakum wa antum libasul lahun. Okay, Allah knows that you are deceiving yourselves in this respect, so He has forgiven you and granted you ease. Now, how were the people deceiving themselves in this respect? The Quran does not specify. This is one of the reasons why we need to turn to the traditional commentaries on the Quran, because the traditional commentaries give us some information which otherwise we would not have guessed. All of that information is not necessarily authentic. The traditional commentators on the Quran sometimes, in order to answer puzzles that they found in the text of the Quran, would turn to explanations which sometimes have no basis. Sometimes they picked up explanations which were something like stories circulating among the people of the book, and they incorporated that into the tafsir. We have to be aware of all of that. Nonetheless, to disregard the traditional tafsirs altogether would be a mistake, because we would deprive ourselves in that case from knowing much of the traditional knowledge that formed the basis of traditional tafsir. So we need to know that, we need to master that if we're going to go forward with it. And sometimes we pick up gems that are very interesting, and they help us to form a holistic picture of the Quranic verses, although, of course, we would not insist too much on those details. But here's the detail that we need to be aware of. So in what way were the people deceiving themselves prior to this verse being revealed like this? The story is that people at that time thought that the way to fast was from dawn to dawn, in such a way that if somebody fell asleep after at night without eating, then he would have to remain until the morning meal, or even that he would not be able to eat at night, and he would have to remain till the following night and break his fast at that time. So sometimes carrying on with the fast like this meant that they would faint during the day, especially those who worked laboriously. And in that case, they were not able to maintain the self-imposed regulation. Now, they may have learned of such a kind of regulation from the people of the book, because when our Jewish friends fast on Yom Kippur, they make it a 25-hour fast. Essentially, it's a 24-hour fast, but they add some more time in order to be absolutely sure, and that to make sure that they don't contravene the time. And so it becomes 25 hours altogether. So maybe the Muslims picked it up from their neighbors and thought, okay, so that's the way to fast. And now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving them ease and telling them they don't need to overburden themselves like that, deceiving themselves into thinking that they could maintain such a long fast. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has now given them ease. He's forgiven them for what has been done in the past, and He's given them ease now by making the fast easier, by allowing for them to eat and drink during the night. So therefore, you see in the middle of the fifth line there, therefore, be intimate with them and seek that which Allah has ordained for you. You may also eat and drink until the white thread of dawn becomes distinct to you from its black thread. Then fast until the onset of night, but refrain from intimate acts during the time when you remain attached to devotion within the mosques. Here I have to explain that we came across the word i'tikaf in the Arabic text, but we can't leave the word i'tikaf, because if we're preparing an English translation that non-Muslims can equally understand along with Muslims, then we can't have too many words in Arabic just retained, because we don't feel comfortable translating the words. Now, i'tikaf obviously has acquired a technical meaning in the Islamic societies. It refers most likely to the act of secluding oneself in the masjid in the last 10 days and nights of Ramadan. It could apply at another time as well. Somebody may voluntarily at some other time decide, I want to go devote myself to worship in the masjid. That'll be an i'tikaf. It'll be a voluntary one. It could occur anytime during the year. But most likely, as I said, when we speak of i'tikaf, we mean that resignation to the worship of Allah in the mosques in the last 10 days and nights of Ramadan. But we don't want to read all of those nuances into the Arabic text of the Quran itself, because maybe some of those details of the observance of i'tikaf emerged later and was not actually intended in all of those details in the Quranic text itself. So we have to stick as closely as possible to the Arabic text of the Quran and not to read too many regulations into that as if the Quran meant all of those things. So here, the simplest way I found of rendering this, while preserving the idea that we have of i'tikaf without reading too much into it, into the Quran, is like this: but refrain from intimate acts during the time when you remain attached to devotion within the mosques. And now, finally, to conclude, these are the limits imposed by Allah, so stay well within them. In this way, Allah explains His revelations to humankind so that they may be conscious of Him. Verse 188, believers, do not eat up your property among yourselves in a vain manner, nor should you knowingly hand it down to judges, seeking thereby to sinfully devour a portion of the property of other people. As I read that, I realized that the word "the" before judges is not required. So in English, we would just simply say, hand it down to judges. So do not hand it down to judges. Okay. Do not eat up your property among yourselves in a vain manner. Now, we should think carefully about how we are dealing with the property that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed at our disposal. The wealth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us is not ours to use in whichever way we desire, but it is to be used in a responsible manner. So we should not use up the property in a vain manner, whether it is our own wealth or the wealth of the community as a whole. Here it is in the plural, so something there is evident in the Arabic text, which does not come through easily in the English translation. To say it in the English translation, we would have to say the wealth of your own people. But if we say it that way in English, we might again go on another tangent, lose something else that is evident in the Quranic text. So it's not just simply your own people. It is you and your own people. It's your community as a whole, and you in particular. Don't use up your own wealth or the wealth of your community in a vain manner. Do not waste the wealth of your community and of yourselves. لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل. Do not use up the wealth of you yourselves and your communities in a way that is called batil, that is null and void. It brings no benefit, no use, and so on. So we should be careful about that. How do we use our own funds? How do we use our community's resources, and so on? And nor should you hand it down to judges, seeking thereby to sinfully devour a portion of the property of other people. So what's being spoken about here? This is about rishwa. It's about bribery. We should not be bribing the judges in order to get a decision in our favor, in which case we'll be committing injustice. And the result often is that we usurp the property of other people, and in this unjust manner, and this is sinful. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, do not know that, do not do that, وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ, while you know. So I've translated just simply knowingly. Do not knowingly hand it down to the judges, seeking thereby to sinfully devour a portion of the property of other people. Now, hand it down to the judges. That's a literal rendering of the Arabic here. وَتُدْلُوا بِهَا إِلَى الْحُكَّامِ. And Sheikh Muhammad Mutawalli Sha'arawi, in his book Miracles of the Quran, commented upon this, and he said that the Quran has put it in the most apt way here, because when we think of judges, we think of the judge sitting in a high chair, and if we're to approach the judge, we're approaching from below. So if you're going to give the judge a bribe, you're going to actually raise it up to the judge. But the Quran says, do not lower it down to the judge, because when you are giving a bribe to the judge, you're actually lowering it to the judge. Why? Because the judge is now debasing himself or herself. The judge is belittling his or her office by coming down to that low level of receiving a bribe. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best why it is put in this way. Perhaps there's something to what Sheikh Sha'arawi said there. But I'm thinking that there is also something more, that there is an expression in English about something being done under the table. So when it's being done, when it's a bribe, then naturally it's going to be done under the table. So it is actually lowering physically as well. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. The Quran has so many shades of meaning, and often we're amazed at how many shades of meaning apply to the Quranic text. And we see that the Quran is put in a most apt way. So now, the last question we should answer here is, what does this verse have to do with fasting? Well, this verse has something to do with eating, and though it is not about eating haram food per se, like, somebody picks up and says this is a piece of pork. So now, if somebody picks up a piece of pork, now obviously no Muslim is going to eat that. The Muslim is going to be saying yuck before just thinking about it. Because we've been so accustomed to staying away from that and considering it to be haram. But the Quran is saying that just as you will not eat and drink during the fasting period for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you should not eat up haram things. The utmost example of haram things here is to eat up the property of other people, which you have acquired unjustly by bribing the judges. So just as it is haram for you to eat during the day of Ramadan when you have pledged yourself to fast, and just as it is haram to eat what we call haram foods and what we know to be haram foods, it is also haram to eat up the property of other people, which is obtained in an illegal or sinful way. So that's the connection I see between this and the verses that precede dealing with fasting. Now, next week, we're going to be dealing with verses regarding struggling in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I want to look at those. So far, we have dealt with new laws for a new community. Under that broader heading, which we're still studying, we have looked at dietary regulations. Then we looked at laws of restitution and inheritance. That was up to last week. And this week, tonight, we have looked at rules regarding fasting in verses 183 to 188. Next week, inshallah, we will look at regulations governing justified warfare. Those are in verses 189 to 195. Only a few verses, but we'll have a lot to say about that because we will have a chance to describe what is justified warfare, what is the theory of just war that has been developed by scholars even outside of the Islamic tradition, and how does the Quran fit in with that perception of what is meant by a just war. What kinds of wars does the Quran approve of, and by extension doesn't approve of, and within a war, what are the regulations by which Muslims must abide by? For example, you cannot attack non-combatants, you cannot attack women and children, for example. And what about after the war is over? As the Quran puts it, after the war lays down its burdens, what are Muslims then to do? What responsibilities does the victorious party have in terms of repatriation and rectifying harms that have resulted from the war? So we'll look at all of that next week, inshallah. So I said we'll look at the Arabic text, so we'll look at that very quickly. Some topics remaining in this chapter. We'll deal with commercial law, and we'll deal with family law, such as marriage and divorce, and also with Hajj, the regulations regarding Hajj. So much more to follow in this surah, but we've gone up to about 2/3 already of the surah, so we're getting towards the end here, and then we will move to Surah Al Imran. In the meantime, looking at the verses here, يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. That's a verse as well that you might want to memorize. It's short and sweet. O you who believe, fasting has been prescribed for you as it was prescribed for those before you, so that you may achieve taqwa, which I've translated as you may be conscious of God. And then ayyama ma'dudat. So we looked at that, and I want to move on to this. The verse that says that they are clothing for you. أحل لكم ليلة الصيام الرفث إلى نسائكم هن لباس لكم وأنتم لباس لهن. So towards the third of the first verse there, we have starting with hunna لباس لكم وأنتم لباس لهن. That's the short phrase that I said you can easily memorize. It's only 6 words. And then you're equipped wherever you are. You could be in a bus talking to somebody you're traveling with, and the subject of women's rights comes up. And you can say, hey, the Quran speaks about this as a mutual relationship between husband and wife, and says, Hunna libasul lakum wa antum libasul lahun. They are clothing for you, and you are clothing for them. So that is all the time that I want to spend exegeting these verses. And at this time, then, I will thank the people who have been joining us from around the globe online. And then I will turn inward to the local community to answer their questions. For this is the night, folks, as you will remember, that I've dedicated to serve the local community and to deal with their questions firsthand. And I want to thank you all for joining us from around the globe. I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bless you all, bless all of your loved ones, protect you all from COVID-19 and from every other sickness, disease, distress, and stress. And in the meantime, be aware that on Sunday, God willing, at 1:30 p.m., I will be doing a live post right here on my Facebook page. So do join me for that Sunday evening, Toronto time, 1:30 in the Sunday afternoon, Toronto time, 1:30 p.m. So until then, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect you all. All the best. Allahumma akum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.